The Nature of Personal Reality by Jane Roberts. Copyrighted material, all rights reserved.
Preface by Seth. The Manufacture of Personal Reality.
Session 609, April 10th, 1972, 9:29 p.m., Monday. Jane first mentioned a couple of weeks ago that Seth, her transpersonality, would start another book of his own soon. The idea had just come to her after supper one night. We hadn't taken it very seriously, since we'd finished proofreading Seth's first book, Seth Speaks: The Eternal Validity of the Soul, only last month. Certainly, we weren't prepared for the fact that he was quite capable of launching another such project so quickly. Nor did Jane have any conscious thoughts about subject matter or a title for any projected Seth book. However, in last Wednesday's regularly scheduled session, Seth had confirmed her anticipations in so many words, but without setting a date.
Now, Rupert,
As Seth calls Jane,
is quite correct. We are preparing for another one and giving you a rest in between. The volumes automatically unite the material and present it within certain frameworks of discipline. As you know, some considerable time is taken with your preparation of notes, and so I have been waiting a while. Rupert sensed this quite clearly, and as usual feels twinges, wondering what I am going to write about and what kind of a book it will be. Such a book can be given quite normally and quietly along with your regular routine of sessions, adding to your own knowledge and ultimately helping others also. I suggest the simplest of formats, always the least complicated as far as any mechanics are concerned. Do you follow me?
yes, I'd answered, whereupon Seth had discussed other matters for the rest of the evening. As we sat for tonight's session, Jane said,
Well, Seth's all ready, and I've got the urge to get going. Maybe he'll start his book.
She hasn't been dwelling upon the subject particularly, or at least I don't remember her saying much about it. The energy at Jane's command still impresses me, especially when I consider that she weighs less than 95 pounds. Given her permission, Seth can come through very powerfully indeed. Her delivery now, though, was average. By this, I mean that when she speaks for Seth, her voice drops in register, becomes somewhat stronger, and acquires Seth's own deliberate but unique accent and rhythm. Jane took off her glasses and placed them on the coffee table between us. The next moment, her eyes much darker, she was in full trance.
Now, good evening.
Good evening, Seth.
We will call this evening's essay, The Manufacture of Personal Reality. Experience is the product of the mind, the spirit, conscious thoughts and feelings, and unconscious thoughts and feelings. These together form the reality that you know. You are hardly at the mercy of a reality, therefore, that exists apart from yourself or is thrust upon you. You are so intimately connected with the physical events composing your life experience that often you cannot distinguish between the seemingly material occurrences and the thoughts, expectations, and desires that gave them birth. If there are strongly negative characteristics present in your most intimate thoughts, if these actually form bars between you and a more full life, still you often look through the bars, not seeing them. Until they are recognized, they are impediments. Even obstacles have a reason for being. If they are your own, then it is up to you to recognize them and discover the circumstances behind their existence. Your conscious thoughts can be great clues in uncovering such obstructions. You are not nearly as familiar with your own thoughts as you may imagine. They can escape from you like water through your fingers, carrying with them vital nutrients that spread across the landscape of your psyche, and all too often carrying sludge and mud that clog up the channels of experience and creativity. An examination of your conscious thoughts will tell you much about the state of your inner mind, your intentions and expectations, and will often lead you to a direct confrontation with challenges and problems. Your thoughts, studied, will let you see where you are going. They point clearly to the nature of physical events. What exists physically exists first in thought and feeling. There is no other rule.
9:40.
You have the conscious mind for a good reason. You are not at the mercy of unconscious drives unless you consciously acquiesce to them. Your present feelings and expectations can always be used to check your progress. If you do not like your experience, then you must change the nature of your conscious thoughts and expectations. You must alter the kind of messages that you are sending through your thoughts to your own body, to friends and associates. Each thought has a result in your terms. The same kind of thought, habitually repeated, will seem to have a more or less permanent effect. If you like the effect, then you seldom examine the thought. If you find yourself assailed by physical difficulties, however, you begin to wonder what is wrong. Sometimes you blame others, your own background, or a previous life, if you accept reincarnation. You may hold God or the devil responsible, or you may simply say, "That is life," and accept the negative experience as a necessary portion of your lot. You may finally come to a half understanding of the nature of reality and wail, "I believe that I have caused these ill effects, but I find myself unable to reverse them." If that is the case, then regardless of what you have told yourself thus far, you still do not believe that you are the creator of your own experience. As soon as you recognize this fact, you can begin at once to alter those conditions that cause you dismay or dissatisfaction.
A 1-minute pause at 9:49.
No one forces you to think in any particular manner. In the past, you may have learned to consider things pessimistically. You may believe that pessimism is more realistic than optimism. You may even suppose, and many do, that sorrow is ennobling, a sign of deep spiritualism, a mark of apartness, a necessary mental garb of saints and poets. Nothing could be further from the truth. All consciousness has within it the deep abiding impetus to use its abilities fully, to expand its capacities, to venture joyfully beyond the seeming barriers of its own experience. The very consciousnesses within the smallest molecules cry out against any ideas of limitation. They yearn toward new forms and experiences. Even atoms, then, constantly seek to join in new organizations of structure and meaning. They do this instinctively. Man has been endowed, and has endowed himself, with a conscious mind to direct the nature, shape, and form of his creations. All deep aspirations and unconscious motivations, all unspoken drives, rise up for the approval or disapproval of the conscious mind and await its direction. Only when it abdicates its functions does it allow itself to become swayed by negative experience. Only when it refuses responsibility does it finally find itself at the seeming mercy of events over which it appears to have no control. Now, you may take your break.
Thank you. 10 o'clock. Jane was out of trance easily.
I've got a feeling that that's the start of Chapter 1.
Her impression stemmed from the way Seth had called his material an essay tonight, which is something he hasn't done before. It developed that she was partially correct. Resume at 10:07.
Now, books on positive thinking alone, while sometimes beneficial, usually do not take into consideration the habitual nature of negative feelings, aggressions, or repressions. Often these are merely swept under the rug. The authors instead tell you to be positive, compassionate, strong, optimistic, filled with joy and enthusiasm, without telling you what to do to get out of the predicament you may be in, and without understanding the vicious cycle that may seem to entrap you. Such books, again, while sometimes of value, do not explain how thoughts and emotions cause reality. They do not take into consideration the multidimensional aspects of the self or the fact that ultimately each personality, while following definite general laws, must still find and follow his or her own way of adapting these to personal circumstances. If you are in poor health, you can remedy it. If your personal relationships are unsatisfactory, you can change them for the better. If you are in poverty, you can instead find yourself surrounded by abundance. Whether or not you realize it, you have pursued your present course with determination, using many resources, for ends or reasons that at one time made sense to you. You may say, "Poor health makes no sense to me," or "A fractured relationship with my mate is hardly what I was after," or "I certainly have not been pursuing poverty after all my hard work." If you were born poor or born sick, then it certainly seems to you that these circumstances were thrust upon you. Yet they were not, and to some extent or another, they can be changed for the better. This does not mean that effort is not required, and determination. It does mean that you are not powerless to change events, and that each of you, regardless of your position, status, circumstances, or physical condition, is in control of your own personal experience. You see and feel what you expect to see and feel. The world as you know it is a picture of your expectations. The world, as the race of man knows it, is the materialization en masse of your individual expectations. As children come from your physical tissues, so is the world your joint creation.
10:26. Pause, then softly with a smile.
I am writing this book to help each individual solve his or her own personal problems. I hope to do this by showing you exactly the way in which you form your own reality, by explaining the ways in which you can alter it to your advantage. The existence of so-called negative thoughts and feelings will not be glossed over, but neither will your ability to handle these. Period. For they are quite under your control. There are methods of using these as springboards for creativity. At no time will you be told to repress them, to ignore them. You will be shown how to recognize those within your experience, to discover which of them has been allowed to run away with you, and how to manage those that seem to be beyond your control. The methods that I will outline demand concentration and effort. They will also challenge you and bring into your life expansion and alterations of consciousness of a most rewarding nature. I am not a physical personality. Basically, however, neither are you. Your experience now is physical. You are a creator, translating your expectations into physical form. The world is meant to serve as a reference point. The exterior appearance is a replica of inner desire. You can change your personal world. You do change it without knowing it. You have only to use your ability consciously to examine the nature of your thoughts and feelings and project those with which you basically agree. They coalesce into the events with which you are so intimately familiar. I hope to teach you methods that will allow you to understand the nature of your own reality and to point a way that will let you change that reality in whatever way you choose. End of dictation.
Okay, you're pretty tricky starting your book like that.
That is my way. I will give you the title and other pertinent information in a later session, and if you want it, an outline of intent.
I guess Jane would like to see that.
Let us have this one as simple as possible. Give us a moment.
Still in trance, Jane took a long pause at 10:37. Her eyes closed. She sat rocking back and forth with one foot upon the edge of the coffee table.
The book will explain how personal reality is formed, with great stress laid upon the ways of changing unfavorable aspects of individual experience. It will, hopefully, avoid the Pollyanna attributes of many self-help books and tease the reader into an enthusiastic desire to understand the characteristics of reality, if only to solve his or her own problems. The methods given will be highly practical, workable, and within the abilities of any person genuinely concerned with those problems inherent in the nature of human existence. The point will be made that all healings are the result of the acceptance of one basic fact, that matter is formed by those inner qualities that give it vitality, that structure follows expectation, that matter at any time can be completely changed by the activation of the creative faculties inherent in all consciousness. Please title what we have done this evening as my preface, the dictated portion, that is. I bid you a fond good evening.
Thank you very much, Seth. Good night. End at 10:47 p.m. Jane's delivery as Seth had been quiet but rather fast, considering the modest speed I can attain while taking verbatim notes in my homemade shorthand. As soon as she was out of trance, she said,
I think I've got half of the title. It's The Nature of Personal Reality, hyphen or colon, then something else, but I didn't get that part. All of a sudden, I'm exhausted, but don't write that down.
A few notes added later. 6 months were to pass before we learned the rest of the title for Seth's book. While Jane was resting before supper on October 25, 1972, the full name popped into her conscious mind. The Nature of Personal Reality, a Seth book. We held the 623rd session, bridging chapters 4 and 5 that evening. We never did ask Seth for an outline per se. Once the book was underway, we realized it wasn't necessary. This decision also gave Jane as much freedom as possible. The Nature of Personal Reality by Jane Roberts. Copyrighted material, all rights reserved.
Part 1. Where You and the World Meet. Chapter 1. The Living Picture of the World.
Session 610, June 7, 1972, 9:10 p.m., Wednesday. A number of events, foremost among them the death of Jane's mother after an illness of many years, caused us to lay these sessions aside after Seth finished his preface on April 10th. Jane did manage to hold her ESP and writing classes part of the time. She also worked on her novel, The Education of Oversoul 7, which she discusses in her introduction. Through it all, however, we looked forward to our daily participation in Seth's new book. Jane hadn't looked at Seth Speaks for long periods during its production in order to avoid conscious involvement with it. But, she said recently, smiling, she plans to read and use this work session by session as she delivers it. Whatever nervousness she'd felt about producing it was minimal by now. I encouraged her new free attitude. I'll indicate Jane's various states of consciousness as I usually do in these sessions, but the notes can only be hints from an interested observer. The true variety and depth of the various realities and personalities she reaches are qualities that are uniquely hers, and they often defy the written word.
Good evening.
Good evening, Seth.
Now, for dictation. The living picture of the world grows within the mind. The world, as it appears to you, is like a three-dimensional painting in which each individual takes a hand. Each color, each line that appears within it has first been painted within a mind, and only then does it materialize without. In this case, however, the artists themselves are a portion of the painting and appear within it. There is no effect in the exterior world that does not spring from an inner source. There is no motion that does not first occur within the mind. The great creativity of consciousness is your heritage. It does not belong to mankind alone, however. Each living being possesses it, and the living world consists of a spontaneous cooperation that exists between the smallest and the highest, the greatest and the lowly, between the atoms and the molecules, and the conscious reasoning mind. All manner of insects, birds, and beasts cooperate in this venture, producing the natural environment. This is as normal and inevitable as the fact that your breath causes a mist to form on glass if you breathe upon it. All consciousness creates the world, rising out of feeling tone. It is a natural product of what your consciousness is. Feelings and emotions emerge into reality in certain specific ways. Thoughts appear, growing on the bed already laid. The seasons spring up, formed by ancient feeling tones, having deep and abiding rhythms. They are the result, again, of innate creative aspects that are a portion of all life. These ancient aspects lie now deeply buried in the psyches of all species, and from them the individual patterns, the specific blueprints for new differentiations emerge.
9:29.
The body of the earth can be said to have its own soul or mind, whichever term you prefer. Using this analogy, the mountains and oceans, the valleys and rivers, and all natural phenomena spring from the earth's soul, as all events and all manufactured objects appear from the inner mind or soul of mankind. The inner world of each man and woman is connected with the inner world of the earth. The spirit becomes flesh. Part of each individual soul, then, is intimately connected with what we will call the world's soul, or the soul of the earth. The smallest blade of grass or flower is aware of this connection, and without reasoning comprehends its position, its uniqueness, and its source of vitality. The atoms and molecules that compose all objects, whether it be the body of a person, a table, a stone, or a frog, know the great passive thrust of creativity that lies beneath their own existence and upon which their individuality floats, distinct, clear, and unassailable. So does the human individual rise up in victorious distinctiveness from the ancient and yet ever-new fountains of its own soul. The self rises from unknowing into knowing, constantly surprising itself. As you read these sentences, for example, some of your knowledge is conscious knowing and is instantly available. Some is unconscious, but even the unconscious knowledge is knowing in its own unknowing. You always know what you are doing, even when you do not realize it. Your eye knows it sees, though it cannot see itself except through the use of reflection. In the same way, the world, as you see it, is a reflection of what you are, a reflection not in glass, but in three-dimensional reality. You project your thoughts, feelings, and expectations outward, then you perceive them as the outside reality. When it seems to you that others are observing you, you are observing yourself from the standpoint of your own projections. Now you may take a break.
9:46 to 10:09.
Now, you are the living picture of yourself. You project what you think you are outward into flesh. Your feelings, your conscious and unconscious thoughts all alter and form your physical image. This is fairly easy for you to understand. It is not easy, however, to realize that your feelings and thoughts form your exterior experience in the same way, or that the events that appear to happen to you are initiated by you within your mental or psychic inner environment. Your body does not just happen to be thin or fat, tall or short, healthy or ill. These characteristics are mental and are thrust outward by you upon your image. I do not mean to be facetious, but you were not born yesterday. Your soul was not born yesterday in those terms, but before the annals of time, as you think of time. The characteristics that were yours at birth were yours for a reason. The inner self chose them. To a large extent, the inner self can, even now, alter many of them. You did not arrive at birth without a history. Your individuality was always latent within your soul, and the history that is a part of you is written within unconscious memory that resides not only within your psyche, but is faithfully decoded in your genes and chromosomes, and fulfilled in the blood that rushes through your veins. You are aware, alert, and participating in many more realities than you know as your soul expresses itself through you. That consciousness of your usual daylight hours, the ego consciousness, rises up like a flower from the ground of the underneath, the unconscious bed of your own reality. Though you are not aware of it, this ego itself emerges, then falls back again into the unconscious, from which another ego then rises as a new bloom from the springtime earth.
10:27.
You do not have the same ego now that you had 5 years ago, but you are not aware of the change. Ego rises out of what you are, in other words. It is a part of the action of your being and consciousness, but as the eye cannot see its own shifting colors and expressions, as it is not aware that it lives and dies constantly as its atomic structure changes, so you are not aware that the ego continually changes, dies, and is reborn. Physically, the structure of a cell retains its identity, even while the matter that composes it is continually altered. The cell rebuilds itself in line with its own pattern of identity. It is always a part of emerging action, alive and responding even in the midst of its own multitudinous deaths. So, psychological structures form to which various names are given. The names are meaningless, but the structures behind them are not. Such psychological structures also retain their identity, their pattern of uniqueness, even while they change constantly, die, and are reborn. The I rises out of the physical structure. The ego rises out of the structure of the psyche. It cannot see itself as the I cannot. Both look outward, in one case away from the physical body, and in the other case away from the inner psyche to the environment. The creative body consciousness creates the I. The creative inner psyche creates the ego. The body forms the I in the splendid wisdom of its great unconscious knowing. The psyche brings forth the ego that perceives psychologically as the I perceives physically. Both the I and the ego are formations focused toward perception of exterior reality. You may take your break.
10:36 to 10:45.
Now, this is not book dictation. Rupert was correct in the insight of a few moments earlier during break. In my book, we will be going deeper into the nature of the unconscious and the psyche, bringing out some concepts that are of greatest value. Rupert himself, unconsciously, but also to some extent consciously, has been more intrigued with questions concerning consciousness and personality. The role of the ego consciousness, for example, since beginning his novel Oversoul 7.
In late March 1972.
Much is not as yet known. Your psychologists are not able to think in terms of a soul, and your religious leaders are not able, or refuse, to comprehend it psychologically, even to its simplest degree. Metaphysics and psychology have not met, in other words. Now, I am, as I have told you often myself, independent of Rupert. As you know, there are connections between us. He does not understand as yet the true nature of his own creativity. Few people do. There are always psychological reasons for all such phenomena, for any phenomena at all. In some respects, of course, Rupert's children are his books. His psyche is enormously creative. Part of what I seem to be as I speak through him is as deeply and unconsciously a phenomenon as the birth of a child would be. In a different way, so is Oversoul 7, as he thinks of it. These are not physical children at the mercy of time and the elements, but eternal ones, more knowledgeable than the parent, gods springing from the human psyche, half human, half divine. And on this level, the parent is astonished, delighted at the superior accomplishments of its children, the superiority of the offspring, and yet also jealous to some extent. If the books are children symbolically, then in those same terms his representation of my reality is a far more living three-dimensional aspect. He has at various times wondered about schizophrenia, for example. He does not realize that on this level, now, and regardless of my independence and other issues involved, that he creates the personalities free of time, organizes them under the leadership of the conscious mind, and assigns them tasks of great validity and importance, which are then carried out. This is creativity of a most specialized nature, and allows him to probe, if you will, into the nature of consciousness, the psyche, and creativity in a way that few can. Now he himself set up the conditions that would make such results possible. A certain part of my reality is a portion of a certain part of his reality, and here the creation of what I seem to be takes place. Beyond that is my own independent reality. I will have more to say and add to these notes so that they will build up by themselves.
They're very interesting.
If Rupert would regard his problems as challenges, then he would get much better results. That is all for now, and I bid you a fond good evening.
The same to you, Seth. Thank you.
Come to our class sometime.
Okay. Ends at 11:10 p.m. Jane holds her ESP class on Tuesday night each week. Since I'm more solitary by nature, however, I usually type Monday's session then, or work on filing and correspondence. In answer to many queries, I'll explain here why I prefer to write these sessions down instead of using a recorder. Shortly after Seth began to speak through Jane in late 1963, we tried recording the material, but I soon learned that I can type a session from my notes a lot faster than I can from a tape. This is very important, since all of our psychic work is done at night, after we've already put in a full day writing and painting and carrying out all those other actions connected with just living in an organized way. Yet I've had to modify my schedule in order to find the additional time required for the preparation of this manuscript. I paint in the mornings and do this work in the afternoons. When Jane speaks to me as Seth, her delivery is slower than it is during a class session, for instance. This, along with Seth's own instructions, makes punctuation easy. The copy is concise. After an occasional correction, it's ready for publication. Moreover, I think the fact that such high-quality work is obtained this way says important things about these sessions. Session 613, September 11th, 1972, 9:10 p.m., Monday. After holding the first session for this chapter, Jane wrote intently on Oversoul 7 and did some work on a long-range project that she tentatively calls Aspect Psychology. Then, just before we were to resume work on Seth's book, the Great Flood of Friday, June 23, 1972, took place. The flood was the worst on record in this section of the country. It grew out of Tropical Storm Agnes, which, somewhat ironically, had lost its hurricane status by the time it began its erratic course up the east coast from Florida. Agnes was preceded by days of heavy rain that extended on a broad front for hundreds of miles. The storm unexpectedly veered inland after picking up new strength off the Virginia Capes, and when it stalled over New York and Pennsylvania, flooding became inevitable. Jane and I decided to remain behind when, finally, last-minute requests to evacuate our section of Elmira were made before dawn. Our decision, of course, contained deeply symbolic meanings for us that we still only partially understand. The Chemung River passes less than a block from our apartment house on its way through the center of the city. But since we lived on the second floor, we thought we'd be secure. The house was solid, we decided. The neighborhood emptied itself, except for us, and became extremely quiet. The water, thick with topsoil, exuding a near suffocating odor of petroleum effluents, became 1 foot deep in the yard, then 3, then 5. Jane and I found ourselves experiencing a drastic new world, and although Seth hasn't said so yet, I believe that to be one of the reasons we stayed. We sipped wine and used light self-hypnosis to take the edge off our tension. But as we watched the water crawl up the side of the old red brick house next door, our new reality threatened to turn into a terrifying one indeed. Had we made the right decision? By now, escape was probably impossible. I suggested that Jane tune in psychically to see what she could learn about our situation. It's hard to be calm when you're really scared, she said, but began to compose herself. Gradually, she attained a very relaxed state. She told me that the water would reach its highest level late that afternoon. Incredibly, it would become almost 10 feet deep in the yard and reach halfway up the first floor windows of the house next to ours. We would be safe as long as we stayed where we were. Jane sounded awed, though, when she said that the Walnut Street Bridge would go. I was awed, too, since the old steel bridge crossed the Chemung River less than half a block from us. We couldn't see it because of the houses across the street. As soon as Jane had picked up this information, we began to feel better. We ate, played cards, and periodically checked the water level. Several hours passed. The flood crested within 15 minutes of the time Jane had given, and within 3 inches of her projected high water mark. We slept that evening knowing that the water was dropping quickly. The next morning, I walked over to the Walnut Street Bridge. It had been destroyed. Several of its spans had been washed out. We were lucky compared to many others in the city. We'd lost our car, but we had a place to live and had all of our paintings, manuscripts, and records, including the 53 volumes of the Seth material, intact. Since we occupied 2 apartments in order to have enough living and working space, we had room to take in a couple who had been flooded out. The weather was cold and rainy. Our days became a routine of actions devoted to survival, although Jane finished Oversoul 7 early in July and resumed her classes. This book was put aside for a long time. In August, Jane held 1 session on the flood, in which Seth had time to just touch upon the various reasons behind our personal involvement in it. And late that month, and in September, we had several house guests in connection with psychic work. One of them was Richard Bach, author of the very successful book Jonathan Livingston Seagull. When she felt it was time to resume work on Seth's book, Jane discovered to her surprise that she was somewhat nervous about it. Yet, speaking for Seth, she resumed dictation so smoothly that it seemed there hadn't been any such thing as a 3-month lapse.
Good evening.
Good evening, Seth.
Now, give us a moment, and we will resume dictation.
All right.
Your experience in the world of physical matter flows outward from the center of your own psyche. Then you perceive this experience. Exterior events, circumstances, and conditions are meant as a kind of living feedback. Altering the state of the psyche automatically alters the physical circumstances. There is no other valid way of changing physical events. It might help if you imagine an inner living dimension within yourself in which you create, in miniature psychic form, all the exterior conditions that you know. Simply put, you do exactly this. Your thoughts, feelings, and mental pictures can be called incipient exterior events, for in one way or another each of these is materialized into physical reality. You change even the most permanent-seeming conditions of your life constantly through the varying attitudes you have toward them. There is nothing in your exterior experience that did not originate within you. Interactions with others do occur, of course, yet there are none that you do not accept or draw to you by your thoughts, attitudes, or emotions. This applies in each area of life. In your terms, it applies both before life and after it. In the most miraculous fashion are you given the gift of creating your experience. In this existence, you are learning to handle the inexhaustible energy that is available to you. The mass condition of the world and the situation of each individual in it is the materialization of man's progress as he forms his world.
9:24.
The joy of creativity flows through you as effortlessly as your breath. From it, The most minute areas of your outer experience spring. Your feelings have electromagnetic realities that rise outward, affecting the atmosphere itself. They group through attraction, building up areas of events and circumstances that finally coalesce, so to speak, either in matter as objects or as events in time. Some feelings and thoughts are translated into structures that you call objects. These exist, in your terms, in a medium you call space. Others are translated instead into psychological structures called events that seem to exist in a medium you call time. Space and time are both root assumptions, which simply means that man accepts both and assumes that his reality is rooted in a series of moments and a dimension of space. So your inner experience is translated in those terms. Even the duration of an event or object in space or time is determined by the intensity of the thoughts or emotions that gave it birth. Duration in space is not the same as duration in time, however, though it may seem that this is the case. I am speaking in your terms now. An event or object that exists briefly in space may have a much greater duration in time. It may have far greater importance and intensity existing in your memory, for example, long after it has disappeared in space. Such an event or object does not merely exist symbolically within your mind or memory, but in your terms, its actual reality continues as a time event. Nor is its reality in space annihilated as long as it exists within your mind. Let us take a very simple example. A child has been told not to play with a doll. The order is disobeyed. The child, wittingly or unwittingly, breaks the doll, and it is finally thrown away. The doll exists in time quite vitally as long as the child or the adult-to-be remembers it.
9:40.
If the doll sat on a bureau, and this is also vividly recalled, then the space in which the doll sat still carries the impression of the doll, though other objects may be placed there. You react, therefore, not only to what is visible to your physical eyes in space or to what is directly in front of you in time, but also to objects and events whose reality is still with you, though they may seem to have disappeared. Basically, you create your experience through your beliefs about yourself and the nature of reality. Another way to understand this is to realize that you create your experiences through your expectations. Your feeling tones are your emotional attitudes toward yourself and life in general, and these generally govern the large areas of experience. They give the overall emotional coloration that characterizes what happens to you. Period. You are what happens to you. Your emotional feelings are often transitory, but beneath there are certain qualities of feeling uniquely your own that are like deep musical chords. While your day-to-day feelings may rise or fall, these characteristic feeling tones lie beneath. Sometimes they rise to the surface, but in great long rhythms. You cannot call these negative or positive. They are instead tones of your being. They represent the most inner portion of your experience. This does not mean that they are hidden from you, or are meant to be. It simply means that they represent the core from which you form your experience. If you have become afraid of emotion or the expression of feeling, or if you have been taught that the inner self is no more than a repository of uncivilized impulses, then you may have the habit of denying this deep rhythm. You may try to operate as if it did not exist, or even try to refute it. But it represents your deepest, most creative impulses. To fight against it is like trying to swim upstream against a strong current. Now, you may take your break.
9:57 to 10:06.
These feeling tones then pervade your being. They are the form your spirit takes when combined with flesh. From them, from their core, your flesh arises. Everything that you experience has consciousness, and each consciousness is endowed with its own feeling tone. There is great cooperation involved in the formation of the earth as you think of it, and so the individual living structures of the planet rise up from the feeling tone within each atom and molecule. Your flesh springs about you in response to these inner chords of your being, and the trees, rocks, seas, and mountains spring up as the body of the earth from the deep inner chords within the atoms and molecules which are also living. Because of the creative cooperation that exists, the miracle of physical materialization is performed so smoothly and automatically that consciously you are not aware of your part in it.
10:16.
The feeling tone, then, is the motion and fiber, the timber, the portion of your energy devoted to your physical experience. Now it flows into what you are as a physical being and materializes you in the world of seasons, space, flesh, and time. Its source, however, is quite independent of the world that you know. Once you learn to get the feeling of your own inner tone, then you are aware of its power, strength, and durability, and you can, to some extent, ride with it into deeper realities of experience. The incredible emotional richness and variety and splendor of physical experience is the material reflection of this inner feeling tone. It pervades the events in your life, the overall inner direction, the quality of perception. It fills up and illuminates the individual aspects of your life and largely determines the pervasive subjective climate in which you dwell. It is the essence of yourself. Its sweeps are broad in range, however. It does not determine, for example, specific events. It paints the colors in the large landscape of your experience. It is the feeling of yourself, inexhaustible. In other terms, it represents the expression of yourself in pure energy, from which your individuality arises, the you of you, unmistakably given identity that is never duplicated. This energy comes from the core of being, from all that is, and represents the source of never-ending vitality. It is being in you. As such, all of the energy and power of being is focused and reflected through you in the direction of your three-dimensional existence. You may take your break.
10:35 to 10:47.
While your feeling tone is uniquely yours, still it is expressed in a certain fashion that is shared by all consciousness focused in physical reality. So in those terms, you spring from the earth as all the other creatures and natural living structures. You are, while physical, a portion of nature, therefore, not apart from it. Trees and rocks possess their own consciousness and also share a gestalt consciousness, even as the living portions of your body. The cells and organs have their own awarenesses and a gestalt one. So the race of man also has individual consciousness and a gestalt or mass consciousness, of which you individually are hardly aware. The mass race consciousness, in its terms, possesses an identity. You are a portion of that identity while still being unique, individual, and independent. You are confined only to the extent that you have chosen physical reality and so placed yourself within its context of experience. While physical, you follow physical laws or assumptions. These form the framework of corporeal expression. Within this framework, you have full freedom to create your experience, your personal life in all of its aspects, the living picture of the world. Your personal life, and to some extent your individual living experience, help create the world as it is known in your time.
11 o'clock.
In this book, we will be speaking about your own subjective world and your part in the creation of events both private and shared. It is important before we continue that you realize that consciousness is within all physical phenomena, however. It is vital that you realize your position within nature. Nature is created from within. The personal life that you know rises up from within you, yet it is given. Period. Since you are a part of being, then in a certain fashion you give yourself the life that is being lived through you.
Pause.
New paragraph. You make your own reality. There is no other rule. Knowing this is the secret of creativity. I have spoken of you, yet this must not be confused with the you that you often think you are, the ego alone. For the ego is only a portion of you. It is that expert part of your personality that deals directly with the contents of your conscious mind and is concerned most directly with the material portions of your experience. The ego is a very specialized portion of your greater identity. It is a portion of you that arises to deal directly with the life that the larger you is living. The ego can feel cut off, lonely, and frightened, however, if the conscious mind lets the ego run away with it. The ego and the conscious mind are not the same thing. The ego is composed of various portions of the personality. It is a combination of characteristics, ever-changing, that act in unitary fashion. The portion of the personality that deals most directly with the world.
Very slowly at 11:18.
The conscious mind is an excellent perceiving attribute, a function that belongs to inner awareness, but in this case is turned outward toward the world of events. Through the conscious mind, the soul looks outward. Left alone, it perceives clearly. In certain terms, the ego is the eye through which the conscious mind perceives, or the focus through which it views physical reality. But the conscious mind automatically changes its focus throughout life. The ego, while appearing the same to itself, ever changes. It is only when the conscious mind becomes rigid in its direction or allows the ego to take on some of its own functions that difficulties arise. Then the ego allows the conscious mind to work in certain directions and blocks its awareness in others. And so it is from your larger identity that you form the reality that you know. It is up to you to do this with joy and vigor, clearing your conscious mind so that the deeper knowledge of your greater identity can form joyous expressions in the world of the flesh.
11:25.
End of the chapter. End of dictation. Now, the book will enable others to help themselves, and will reach a far greater audience and help more people than Rupert could meet alone, or than I could help through individual sessions. Those who request help should be put on a list to make sure they know of the book.
That's a good idea. By mail and telephone, Jane has been getting more requests for help than she can handle.
Rupert does not need to feel he must have individual sessions then for people who must work this through alone. And now I bid you a fond good evening.
Thank you, Seth, and good evening. It's been very pleasant to sit in on a session again.
If you have questions, you may ask them.
I paused, considering the late hour, then asked Seth for his opinion about the recent visit of a young scientist from a western state. Jane, both as Seth and as herself, had made a good start at tuning in on certain technical information. I felt, however, that a great amount of time and effort would be needed on a regular basis over a period of years, probably, for Jane to make full use of her abilities in such specialized endeavors.
The effect of the visit was good, particularly on Rupert. We will get to his scientific questions. For Rupert's confidence, I wanted this book decently begun. Other sessions may take over from dictation now and then, but the main project will be the book. The flood material will be used as an example in the book later on, when natural disasters are discussed. So you will have that material, and others may use and understand it. And now, a fond good evening.
Thanks once again, Seth. And at 11:32 p.m., Jane was quickly out of an excellent dissociated state.
I'm glad Seth's working on his book again. I know it's silly, but I feel a lot better. I was even wondering if my own attitude was holding the thing up now, after all of those other interruptions.
And so, like Seth Speaks, this is really two books in one. It's not only about the nature of personal reality, but the circumstances surrounding Jane's production of the material and the many ideas she has concerning it. I was happy to learn that Seth plans to incorporate flood data in his book. I've been concerned lest that subject be pushed aside by other events, then perhaps forgotten. The Nature of Personal Reality by Jane Roberts. Copyrighted material, all rights reserved.
Chapter 2. Reality and Personal Beliefs.